Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, I'm going to make this pretty brief because we're preparing to return from being out of town. Once again, I have a less than ideal setup here where I have to hold my laptop actually in my lap rather than on a desk in front of me, so I have to look down at the camera, etc. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about today was my assessment of the recent, on March 18th, protests against the U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine. Uh, so, first of all, uh, it does seem that there was a pretty decent turnout for this march. There were, although I haven't yet seen pictures of the full crowd to compare with, it appears that more people turned out in Washington, D.C. for this protest on the weekend near the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And in addition, there were many, many protests around the country this time, whereas there weren't so many on February 19th. So that was good to see. And hopefully, this is a harbinger of things to come. And as you know, if you've watched this channel or just on social media and reading about this stuff a bit, there was quite a bit of controversy about the February 19th Rage Against the War Machine protest in D.C. Uh, Basically revolving around the fact that there was a very politically diverse group of people speaking there and attending, including some who were libertarian or conservative and so forth. Whereas uh, this most recent march was overwhelmingly a coalition of liberal or left wing groups that organized and participated in this one. And yeah, you can make arguments either way about whether it's best to uh, try to bring together a coalition where there's general agreement on lots of other issues besides opposing the war in Ukraine, as this march did, versus February 19th, where there was a group of people who really may well have agreed on almost every other, disagreed on many, many other issues besides the war. Um, so, I think it would have been best if there had been an effort to bring together as broad a group of people as possible, but and that seldom happens, unfortunately. Um, and one thing that folks who supported the February 19th march predicted about response to the March 18th protests or discussion of it beforehand was that many of the same people who were very critical of the February 19th Rage Against the War Machine protests and said it wasn't a real anti-war protest and it was a bunch of right wingers, etc., which is nonsense because there were many, many people who spoke there, such as Jill Stein and many others who are unequivocally on the left. But in any case, it was anticipated that those who were so critical of that march would not necessarily turn around and be supportive of this one. And on one hand, I do have to say that there wasn't a huge amount of discussion from these quarters about this most recent march leading up to it. World Socialist website, for example, didn't have any reports on the March 18th protest at all, or any, and just had one article endorsing the march by their student group in the days leading up to it. And it was kind of a mixed bag. generally in terms of the amount of support for the March 18th anti-war protests from critics of the earlier one. So I'm going to make this brief. What I want to do is just to focus on a perspective that I heard a lot from speakers at the March 18th protest. I mean, specifically the one in Washington, D.C. I haven't listened to speakers from the other one. And basically, I guess my main criticism of many of the speakers that spoke in Washington on March 18th is that many of them went out of their way to condemn Russia's launching of its special military operation last February. And didn't really necessarily give any viable alternatives as to what Russia could have done instead to address security concerns of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine or Russia itself. So let me just briefly play for you, or I will play the whole speech for you. One of the speeches that was given at the March 18th rally by Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink. So let's just have a look at that here, and then we'll talk about it as kind of representative of many of the political perspectives that were represented at the March 18th rally by the speakers.
So raise your hand if you're a Putin apologist. That's what I'm called all over the place. And you know why? Because we want to stop the suffering and the killing, because we care about the Ukrainian people, because we care about the soldiers on all sides, because we want to end the war. We're not Putin apologists, we are peace lovers. We are people who want to see an end to war. So, this guy here asking who invaded. You know, I am condemning Russia till I'm blue in the face. Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. It made a horrible mistake. And the U.S. makes a horrible mistake by throwing more fuel into the fire, right? How many billions of dollars of weapons are we going to keep sending? It's been $46 billion of just weapons already. So we send all these different weapons and it's never enough because there is a stalemate. Because it is not a winnable war.
It's not a stalemate.
Because this war won't be won on the battlefield. It will be solved at the negotiating table. Yeah. Is sabotaging negotiations. I want to know, when they were close to getting a peace accord back in March, why my government came in and said no. I want to know, when just recently the Chinese came out with a peace plan, why did our government say absolutely ridiculous? And I want to know, in front of the White House, why Biden can't pick up the goddamn phone and talk to Putin. When we have a war that will only be solved at the negotiating table, I want to know why every single Democrat voted for $40 billion to keep this war going. I want to know why, when now the AP polls say that only 48% of Americans, despite all the war propaganda, only 48% of Americans say they want to send more weapons. say is that the people in Congress and the White House are not representing us. We have to be louder. Join us with Code Pink and Peace in Ukraine as we march through the halls of Congress, demanding that they represent us and call for peace talks. Do you know that right now in Congress the word negotiate is a bad word? It's ridiculous. So join us as we pressure the White House and Congress, and join us as we echo the sentiment from around the globe, especially in the global south. Just like President Lula from Brazil said when he was pushed to send weapons to Ukraine. You know what he said? We don't want to join this war. We want to end this war. So let's say it loud. No more war. Peace talks now. No more war. Peace talks now.
Okay, so I mean, not a bad speech. She definitely pointed out the absolute intransigence of the U.S. government in terms of refusing to try and negotiate an end to the conflict, actively sabotaging, actively undermining peace talks back near the beginning of the war last March and April. But she doesn't really acknowledge that it takes. Well, I mean, she doesn't really acknowledge that Russia has been attempting to negotiate an end to this conflict for years now. Because I mean, she doesn't mention this, but this war actually goes back to 2014, when, as I've talked about many times on this channel before, as a result of the U.S.-backed coup that brought to power forces that were very right-wing and anti-Russian, a civil war started where basically the Ukrainian government went on a rampage, against people of Russian descent throughout Ukraine, as well as basically anybody critical of the government. It became a very, very repressive government, and I've talked about that brutal repression many times. And as a result, first you had Crimea, people of Crimea voting to secede from Ukraine and join Russia, and then shortly after that, also in 2014. You had people in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, vote for independence from Ukraine. And as a result of their secession, vote for secession, as a result of their extreme unhappiness with the coup government, the Ukrainian military proceeded to attack the Donbass region, and that's been going on. A conflict between the Ukrainian military and paramilitary, fascist groups, and militias that were organized for the self-defense of the Donbass region. That's been going on for 9 years now, and there was an attempt to negotiate an end to the conflict in 2014 and again in 2015 through the Minsk peace talks mediated by Russia, France, and Germany between the two sides to the conflict. And it's now come out that Ukraine never intended to honor the peace treaty, and they didn't. They kept right on shelling civilian areas throughout the Donbass region. And then, shortly before Russia entered the fray on February 24th of last year, the shelling escalated, and plans were leaked to Russian intelligence services that Ukraine intended to invade and launch a full-scale invasion of the Donbass region. And so the governments of Donetsk and Luhansk then appealed to Russia for help, and that's what prompted the entry of Russia into the conflict. And there were also attempts to negotiate peace, before this ever started. Back in December of 2021, Russia put forward a peace proposal and a regional security framework that called for both NATO and Ukraine and Russia to withdraw their troops and weapons back away from the conflict region, away from Eastern European countries bordering Russia and so forth. And those proposals were ignored. And meanwhile, leading up to February 24th, the U.S. and its allies began implementing sanctions against Russia, before Russia had even invaded, on top of the sanctions that had been in place since 2014, punishing, quote-unquote, Russia for Crimea residents' decision to vote to join Russia. And Russia, the Russian government has said several times throughout the conflict that they were willing to negotiate, and those attempts to negotiate have repeatedly been rebuffed. So, what exactly was the Russian government supposed to do with, as Medea herself acknowledges, the adamant refusal of Ukraine and its Western backers to negotiate an end to the conflict? It takes two sides to negotiate an end to the conflict. And yes, it would obviously be great if we could end this conflict tomorrow. But, as she pointed out herself, even recently, when it was clear that the Ukrainian military was on the verge of collapse, Ukraine and its Western backers in this proxy war against Russia have still refused to negotiate. So the peace proposal from China was just simply rejected outright. There were a number of other speakers who took a similar perspective to Medea Benjamin. So, for example, Afeni Evans said basically the same sort of thing. We condemn the illegal invasion of Ukraine while also condemning NATO aggression, she said. Brian Becker was almost the only speaker who mentioned that the war began in 2014, and he also discussed the broader geopolitical context of U.S. plans for regime change in Russia and China. And there was another speaker, Jackie Lukeman from Black Alliance for Peace, who mentioned that 15,000 approximately people have been slaughtered by the Ukrainian military, heavily infiltrated by far-right Nazi types since 2014. So, there was a mixture of perspectives, but overall, I think there just wasn't enough. Medea said many of the right things, pointing out how there's this repeated refusal to negotiate an end to the conflict on the part of the U.S., Ukraine, NATO, etc. And the logical implication of that, given that it takes two to tango, it takes both sides being willing to negotiate for a conflict to come to an end. So what does Ms. Dia expect Russia to do, given that there's a refusal to negotiate, an end to the war on the part of the West. Does she expect them to simply, unilaterally declare a ceasefire and withdraw all their troops from Ukraine, and then, uh, you know, come what may for residents of what was formerly eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and Kherson and Zaporizhia, Crimea, etc. Realistically, what is going to happen if Russia simply unilaterally stops the war without any negotiated settlement is Ukraine's going to just simply do what they were planning to do last February 2022, invade eastern Ukraine and wreak havoc on the population there, slaughter them. So it's fine and dandy to want peace, but you have to recognize what the implications are when one side is completely uninterested in peace. Because, as I've pointed out before, it is the expressly stated objective of the U.S. government to try to overthrow the Russian government and balkanize Russia and make it basically a semi-colony, as it basically was during the 1990s. That's what the U.S. wants to do. And as for Ukraine itself, it's pretty obvious what Russian-hating Nazis in Ukraine want to do to ethnic Russians in Ukraine or former Ukraine. So what's stopping these things from happening? If Russia simply lays down their arms and goes home, nothing. So we have to bear in mind that realistically, the only thing that's going to end this conflict, given U.S. And NATO countries' intransigence, is they're going to have to keep fighting until they defeat the Ukrainian military. Unless something changes in terms of the willingness of Ukraine and its Western backers to negotiate an end. Unless they finally figure out that it's really not in their interest, ultimately, for this conflict to continue. So it's tragic. It's unfortunate. Many, many more lives on both sides are going to be lost. Particularly the Ukrainian side. There are estimates of already a couple 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers having lost their lives. Maybe 20,000 Russian soldiers. Maybe 10,000 civilians, and the tragedy is going to keep mounting until the Ukrainian side is allowed by the U.S. to negotiate an end to the conflict. There was also a teach-in that took place after the protests, where there was some good in-depth discussion about the history of the conflict and the repression by the far-right forces in Ukraine, and that was good to see. But much as it's very difficult to get into a 3 or 4 minute speech, what the background of the conflict is and what has to happen in order for the peace that we all want to take place. That should have happened in the speeches that were given at the protest itself, and that didn't happen enough. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.